All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. As we wait for everyone to get settled and find their seat, their virtual seat, or maybe get a fresh cup of coffee or tea, uh, we want to hear what attack surface and third-party risks you're most concerned with. So if you feel like sharing, drop your top concern in the Q&A box, and we'll get started with the webinar momentarily. Cool. So starting to already see a few responses in here. New zero-day vulnerability, third-party data breach, ransomware, new vulnerability exploitation, AI vulnerability scanning, being used by threat actors. Well, appreciate everyone for sending those in. We will definitely be covering some of your top concerns throughout this session on protecting your first and third-party attack surface. Just some quick housekeeping notes before we kick off our panel. So a recording of the webinar will be sent out later today. Feel free to share with your coworkers or even your friends and family. And please don't hesitate to put a question into that Q&A box. We've got three great panelists today who have a wealth of experience helping organizations protect their first and third-party attack surface. So without further ado, let's meet today's panel, and I'll pass the stage to Maggie to get started.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. My name is Maggie Fitzgerald. I'm a senior sales engineer on the pre-sales side here in North America at Recorded Future. Previous to that, I worked for a security ratings company where I was also a managed service member there. So worked on behalf of a large bank in North America as well in their procurement team. So I'm excited to talk today. Jerry, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Maggie. And thanks, Sam. My name is Jerry Hodge. I work in the product team here at Recorded Future. Among many of the things I get to work with, the one that my first love and primary focus is on our third-party intelligence capability. Before I joined the company in 2020, I'm actually sat on your side of the table. I led the GRC function for a big multinational engineering firm based out of Houston, Texas. Speaking of which, I am a native Texan, but I live in sunny Gothenburg, Sweden at the R&D office for Recorded Future. So very, very pleased to join the conversation today. John?
Hey, John Bach. I'm also part of the product team focused on the attack surface intelligence module. Prior to joining Recorded Future, I spent a couple decades on the security consulting and security product side, mainly focused on offensive security. So essentially attack surface and breaching that attack surface, as well as a heavy focus on AppSec. So in terms of locations, I'm out of Seattle, Washington, and I think we can get rolling now.
Perfect. Well, last and probably least, my name is Sam Langrock. I'll be the panel moderator today. I'm a senior product marketing manager at Recorded Future as well, where I spend my days researching and talking about the problems we solve, the organizations we solve them for, and the people we help. So let's get our panel started. I'll kick it off with our first question. So according to numerous research pieces, the average enterprise can have around 50 to 70 different types of security tools. So I'll start with Jerry on this one. Why are we still having such a hard time protecting our own attack surface and mitigating risks from third-party vendors we work with? What's not working with the current tools we're using?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think when you think about a security stack like that, obviously many of those things are going to be point solutions. So they're going to be things that are really geared towards addressing a very particular problem. So from my perspective, we've got like probably three different ways that we can think about why we're struggling. Firstly, we've got to have a way to kind of tie those point solutions together to like a single, not to use a trope, but a single pane of glass or a single point of truth. And this is something that we see a lot at Recorded Future, that we're trying to make intelligence that hub that ties everything together. The second, and this maybe is one of the self-obvious things as well, but I think one of the things that's really challenging in the security space, and particularly we as defenders, is that the landscape changes, and it changes quite rapidly. So once we feel like we've got our hands around something, it shifts, it changes. Threat actors they're creative, they're smart folks. They have a goal, and they want to get there as quickly and as fast as possible. So that becomes particularly magnified when we think about the lack of cohesion necessarily between some of the tools. And then lastly, and this is maybe particularly true on the third party side, when we think about outsourcing a business function to a third party, whether that's a business service provider, a consulting firm, or a SaaS application, we do this because it's not our core competency, right? It's something that's better for another person to do for our organization while we focus on the things that are really impactful for us. Well, the downside to that is we lose visibility and control, and then our default to that is just to go foist a bunch of compliance standards or frameworks and hope that we get an answer. And I think actually that produces a lot of thrash when we should be focusing on a more like threat model type approach to that. So that's kind of the way I break the problem down. I'm not sure some of my panelists probably have additional comments.
Yeah, I think the sentence there in that question that stands out to me specifically is what's not working with the current tools we're using. And when I think of that in a day-to-day of somebody who's doing these risk assessments for third parties, the overwhelming number that are coming through is just integration challenges. Many tools today, specifically in the third party space, are not designed to work seamlessly together. And that just leads to inherent gaps in security coverage, right? We all have those products that our companies pay for that we might not like to use, we kind of avoid on our day-to-day, or that is shelfware. And that's especially in the third party space, something that, everyone rushed to solve the initial issue, but now we need to work on how do we use these multiple tools together to get the same output or a better output. So I think integration challenges are one thing that, the current tools are lacking. John, do you have any thoughts there?
Sure. Yeah, I think one of the underlying points is that even if you have 50 different security tools, they can only even be effective against something you're aware of. So especially when we're talking about attack surface, both in relation to your infrastructure you may own or manage or third parties, if the tools that are providing you CVEs or monitoring aren't wired into those assets, that's a major gap and continually a major source of issues. So, one of the initial steps we have organizations take when they're onboarding with ASI is make sure if we've identified anything you weren't previously aware of, shadow IT, someone spinning up a deployment, the motion for attack surface reduction, part of that is getting any unknown assets or newly discovered assets into the global security umbrella. So at least even if you have 50 to 70 tools that are in varying states of usage or integration, at least there's something there for you if you've got everything tracked. On the third party side, continually the challenge is that even if you have a good third party risk assessment program, you're getting questionnaires out, you're getting answers back, you have letters of attestation, there's still going to be variance between individual vendors in terms of their technical capabilities on the security side. If you're looking at a new SaaS to sign up for and you go to the security page and they start talking about TLS cipher values and nothing on the actual threat side, then you kind of know you're going to have to almost lead that vendor down the road that you want in order for their security posture to match what you have internally. So it's definitely a challenge, but I think awareness of what you're actually using is the principal goal. If you're not aware, you can't even attempt that motion.
I think on the integration front, kind of John, to your point, and Maggie, I know you talk about this a lot internally about sort of breaking down walls between the third party risk side and the rest of the security organization is, we tend to, leading them down the path, we tend to also on the third party side, I think, forget that we need to contextualize the types of things that we would want to discover about our third parties in relation to what they're actually doing for us. And this is almost like saying like, okay, what are my crown jewels and how are they interacting with this third party? And it could be that we're over here focused on one set of findings with our ratings or our monitoring capability, and actually is completely irrelevant to how that company might represent risk to us. So I think it's a really good point. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think what I've seen previously, at least on the AppSec consulting side of the house, is so there always should be alignment between what your own internal standards would be for that data classification or process, right? Secondarily, as a buyer, for that third party, you're generally in a somewhat advantageous position in terms of driving a deal on their side by meeting those security requirements. So, one of the things I always suggest is don't be shy about saying, here's what our expectations are if we were doing this ourselves. If you want this to actually close and you want us to or maintain our contract, this is what we need out of you. And so I've at least seen frequently in the past, it's a prime motivator for vendors to align with what you're looking for.
I agree.
A great conversation around that first question. Switching up a little bit, according to the 2024 Verizon data breach investigation report, roughly 1/3 of all breaches involved ransomware or another type of extortion technique. So when you think about protecting our first and third party attack surface, what's one step that organizations can take? John, I'll start with you on that one.
Well, there's it's more than one. When we're talking about ransomware, and if we're kind of referencing the VDVR, you've got credentials as a major vector, and then direct exploitation. From the direct exploitation side, there's a down select of exposures or vulnerabilities and misconfigurations or accessible services that are leveraged by ransomware actors. So definitely, when you're doing a first pass, we generally suggest organizations work on the easy stuff first. So easy stuff is not so much you have 3,000 patches to push, it's go find all your accessible RDP servers on the internet and shut those down or filter that off. So I think in terms of first steps, attack surface reduction across the board, and there's in terms of a methodology to follow that doesn't throw a million problems at you, we generally suggest a motion of get your first asset inventory down, look for deprecated assets, so various attributes like it's running end-of-life software, old copyright tags, basically things that don't need really to be online anymore or from external appearances, probably don't have a core business function at this point. Secondarily, it's fast to do a port sweep. So understanding that, hey, so for your internet-facing services, there should be some internal policy aligned with, we have a justification based on the organizational needs for this to be exposed, and it's not just folks standing that stuff up. If you're looking at remediation cycle times, it's generally faster to do firewall and network reconfigs to close off those ports than it is necessarily to interact with 20 different teams to get various services upgraded and reconfigured. Finally, I'd say the biggest thing when we get to credentials is awareness of your external authentication points. So credential stuffing, credential-based attacks is obviously a big thing, especially for services that have a lack of MFA. One of the things we find customers leverage ASI for is being able to go through all the services we identify that could have a login form or some other type of authentication point, and basically going through and making sure, one, is that actually talking to SSO or federated auth, and then two, is it actually using MFA? And so just having that awareness, as an organization, you should have a definitive, accurate list of every single external authentication point that an attacker with elite cred could actually attempt to leverage against. If you don't have that, then you have potential gaps, and even if you have on your front door SSO, you've got MFA, you're doing everything the right way, you never know if someone's setting up just a test server that should only be up for a day or two that is going directly back to your LDAP or bypassing some of the things you've set up in your production security posture. So those are kind of the three things I'd say out of the gate. More than one, but
yeah, it's a good list, John. I think I love hearing you talk about the asset discovery piece and then kind of again, it's like almost a step further looking at the authentication points. Mine's not nearly as technical or like exotic as what you just described, but on the third party side, I think where we run into where we see a lot of customers struggle is they have a similar blind spot in the fact that they don't actually know about all of the vendors that they work with that are in the value chain that are operationally critical, or they do house sensitive data. And they don't know this because this is a really unruly problem, particularly for larger organizations who have a really, really diverse supply chain. So, I mean, my first, and again, it's not a very super fun or exciting exercise, but is to sit down and actually work with procurement, work with the business owners and the application owners, and figure out like where are the crown jewels sitting, and then bring those into the umbrella for continuous monitoring. I think typically, even if we do have an understanding of that ecosystem, we've maybe got them in those companies and third parties in the right sort of cycle of review for questionnaire and like third party audit review, but we're not necessarily continuously monitoring those for any changes to their own infrastructure or to those kind of early pre-warning or precursor signs that something big might be happening. And I think, and I totally get some of the reasons why we do this. You know, we've got things like certain annexes within ISO 27001 that say we have to have, you know, for certain tier one vendors, we got to have some kind of continuous monitoring or performance monitoring for those. But it's really, really critical to make sure it's not just the big boys on the street, the Microsofts of the world that you're monitoring. It's also your accounting firm and your business process outsourcing firms and those types of things that we rely on as businesses, but don't typically come to mind as something that we should monitor.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like building on that, right? The first step is always understanding your attack surface. And I think when we talk about third party and first party risk in separate manners when talking about ransomware, it's actually detrimental because overall, when it comes to ransomware, it's just one global attack surface, right? These are humans with human motives that really the first step I would take is getting to understand these groups, right? What is their opportunity and intent for your organization? That changes over time too. So having some real threat intelligence on these actors and what drives or motivates them, whether, you know, in the ransomware example, of course, it's financially motivated. You have to understand if you're a bank, that's probably going to be you, number one, if you're disclosing, especially that you have some Bitcoin on your financial statements. So understanding and talking about attack surface between first and third party is really like a global issue with your third parties, you know, included in your attack surface, I think is important.
Yeah, I love that point. Sorry, Sam, go ahead.
Well, I just want to double click on that point. And Jerry, you might have an answer for this as well. So in a previous webinar we did with a couple of our financial services clients, they talked about how, you know, they're seeing attacks against their third-party vendors and suppliers more than they are seeing against them because, you know, they're not upheld to the same standards. How should companies, you know, make sure like they're monitoring those smaller vendors that are part of that third-party ecosystem? B, one of the highlights they had was the fact that Recorded Future kind of pulls from the ransomware extortion websites to give you that visibility. Is my third party being mentioned on one of these blogs or dark web posts? But what does that early visibility enable an organization to do? What action should they be taking if they do find that?
Yeah, I think I'm sure Maggie and John, you've got thoughts on this as well, but I think one of the first things is if you've modeled the relationships and you know where the crown jewels are, this is where you can actually kick off some kind of incident response. So if it is ransomware and it's a vendor that you know doesn't process your data and you know that they're not, you know, you've got some kind of backup vendor in place for that, then, you know, I think sometimes we forget in security, like the option of doing nothing is actually a good option, that this is maybe something that we don't necessarily need to respond to. And that everything doesn't need to be like a five alarm fire. At the same time, when you do get the visibility into things being posted, this is where, you know, kind of the visibility of not just, hey, there was a mention, but the file paths that are there. This is when you can actually start sussing out what is the possible exposure. And it lets you have a more tailored conversation, at least on the third party side. When you go to that vendor, it's not a, hey, I heard you got popped, what happened? It's a, hey, there's reports of this. It appears that customer data or data that you don't, is not just yours, was exfiltrated. Were we impacted based on our relationship? And, you know, I think to some of John's points earlier, ultimately we want to prevent a lot of this stuff by observing those kind of early signs. But once we do get to the point where it's happened, then it's about how quickly we can respond and how quickly can we know about it. So.
Yeah, and I think, you know, if you're looking at your vendor onboarding and third party risk, establishing expectations around if you identify an incident or think there's a security issue at the particular vendor, that's part of, you know, something they can expect down the road. So the process has been established that if we have any threat indications, either from, you know, your own internal monitoring or external threat intelligence, we're going to send you everything we have. So you're going to get the information. We're not going to yell at you or come down on you or anything, but we will be communicating that proactively when we have an indicator, and we would expect a response back. The other thing too is I would generally assume, you know, if you're a sophisticated enough organization to be using these types of tools, do not assume that any of your other vendors are using them. So there's especially on the threat intelligence side, in many cases, you will be better positioned to identify those types of issues that are occurring in the vendor than the vendor themselves. And so it's one of those things where, your data is there, your business processes are there. So it helps you as well to kind of give them a down feed when they're actually tagged in that. So.
Yeah. Hey, Maggie, I think this would be a good one for you. There's a question that just popped up in the chat about asking vendors about backups and ransomware tabletop exercises.
Yeah, let me take a look at that. So I saw another one as well around the responsibility of vendor management too. And I think that's a bigger question where teams too need to start taking accountability, especially TPRM teams and the COT at organizations. Nobody wants to really do the dirty work of gathering a list of all the vendors used at a company until they absolutely have to, until the worst case scenario has occurred. So a lot of times when I hear this all the time from customers, right? Our vendor management team doesn't want to, continuously keep a list of all of the products we're using. That's quite literally their job. And in best practices, they should be working towards doing that. And I think that's a global issue where nobody, really wants to take accountability for it. But as we see our attack surfaces growing and our third-party ecosystem growing, it's going to need to happen. And that's the best step for a foundation of a strong TPRM program. Yeah, so the second one I see, should we ask the vendors yeah, of course. I think, the more questions that you are asking that are specific in this nature, right? Have you done simulated ransomware attacks? That's a question that not necessarily a lot of global assessment or auditing companies will do, that can be given to you in a report format, right? I mean, some of them do, some of the larger auditing reports will include ransomware simulation outcomes in those pen testing reports. But I think that tailoring your vendor questionnaire is specific to the outcomes you're looking for in questions such as these will have better outcomes in the long run. Because of course, the worst case scenarios, they say, no, we haven't had a successful outcome in our ransomware simulations. And that opens up a larger discussion around, okay, well then what are you doing to get a successful outcome, right? We always want that path forward and mature from the, okay, help me understand, to help me do more perspective.
Yeah. One point to add on the vendor discovery side of things, because I think having started my career in oil and gas, old established companies who have a long roll of vendors, they're globally dispersed with a lot of regional projects and things like that. One of the places that we always stopped, always started, was said, okay, maybe I've got the BCP or business continuity plan, or I've got the impact assessment. Let me start with what I think are crown jewels for me. Maybe it's financial data, maybe it's HR, PII type stuff, or if obviously if a company like Recorded Future, we've got a lot of intellectual property that we care a lot about. So it's starting with those, and instead of going to vendor management or going to those individual business units and going, please give me a list of everything, you say, hey, I'm trying to understand. You can take a different approach and say, I'm trying to understand where what you do day to day would break down, and why it would break down. And then you can kind of back into that list. I know it's more tedious, but it can help engender a little bit of a partnership there. And it's also always helpful for the security folks to actually understand the business motions, the things that our organizations actually do to make money, and to actually contextualize our security motions in line with those business motions. So that's one comment there. And totally agree on the legal side. Nobody wants to carry around a stick, but that is what those legal contracts are for, is to make sure that we do have legal recourse in the event that something does happen, and there's no other point of recourse. Yeah.
You get your thoughts out there, Jerry? Moving on to the next question, and definitely keep those questions in the chat coming, and we'll either touch on them in the end, or we'll get to them as we go along. But I wanted to talk about how Forrester recently released their Wave report on cybersecurity risk ratings platforms, which Recorded Future was featured in. Now, the second sentence of that report says the CRR market has existed for more than a decade, but its rise has more resembled Sisyphus pushing a boulder uphill again and again than a smooth maturation. And as a marketer, whenever there's a report that has a great line like that, and I have to highlight it. But according to Gartner, 52% of organizations use these types of vendors to manage third-party risks. Maggie, you were part of one of these organizations before Recorded Future. But they also say cybersecurity teams struggle to build resilience against third-party related disruptions and influence third-party related business decisions. So I'll start with Maggie on this one. How can a solution like Recorded Future kind of overcome some of these disadvantages of working with that traditional cybersecurity risk ratings vendor?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think since 2011, when security ratings first came out, we've made immense progress in being able to sort of put a number on the risk of organizations we don't know much about their security program, but from an external perspective. And that has been great. However, when we think about the maturity of those products, I think the rational next step is to connect risk intelligence with risk response. So that from, previously mentioned that this is going to help teams mature from the stance of help me understand to help me do more. I think that's where intelligence is necessary, and Recorded Future takes a great stab at that to connect risk response and risk intelligence. So for example, if there's operational downtime, you want the quickest answer in terms of which of your third parties has been impacted by that, right? Or if that's going to, from a business continuity standpoint, as Jerry mentioned, impact yourself. So as quickly as you can get that answer and understand the volume or the impact across, your third parties, the better. And an intelligence perspective on that is necessary. So I think, Recorded Future's speed of collection and just breadth of sources is something that we've been able to see mature those programs that use the, performance metric of a security ratings and want to bring their response to the next level. I know Jerry had a lot to do with that maturation of our rating too. You want to speak to that?
Yeah, sure. So I think, one of the things that I think about with the traditional rating capability, and you use the word performance a couple times, Maggie, is that I think therein lies some of the challenge. Is that when one of the things is you're looking for a notion of performance, you're necessarily looking for things that you can go to your vendor and ask them to fix. So your patching cadence is at 34 days. We'd like to see it at 26. You've got X number of expired certificates, or these types of things, that there can be a palpable shift in what is externally observed, which is a very compliance driven perspective. One of the things I think about is compliance is the floor, not the ceiling, right? So, and part of what we need to get to with resilience is a focus on not just the things that are fixable, but the things that are emerging or that could represent some kind of major event, even if there's not something really tactical like patching a system or taking a system offline, like what you get in those rating services. And I think resiliency, it presupposes a kind of nimbleness, which means I, as a business, can pull multiple levers, not just the reach out to my vendor kind of thing, but I can have multiple strategic levers to pull to make sure that even if something does happen that maybe was completely unpreventable on the part of that third party, I'm still geared in such a way to give my business advance notice so that they can, spin up the backup or whatever it might be. So that's one of the ways that we think about it, which is also why the risk scoring on the Recorded Future side is highly, highly responsive. So it doesn't follow a weighted average model. It follows a severity of event and potential impact model, which says you could be spotless, but the moment you show up on a ransomware extortion site, it's going to jump up to a red rating, because we want folks to be able to respond quickly to that, and then suss that out, how that might impact them, and then move from there.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, I think the 2 points that I'd add is the real time and the nature that it's not a necessarily historical look back is a key differentiator for us. That too, with a lot of ratings vendors over the years, their approach may not have matured too much or take advantage of those other sources, because people have gotten used to the score being a little fuzzy in certain cases. So what you want to have is a clear understanding of what's going into that score, and at least a sophistication model. Like, you shouldn't need to be paying for a vendor that is just pulling in third-party IP reputation feeds and that's it. So there's definitely making sure that they've been keeping up with the evolution of that market, and likewise are tracking the same types of technical criteria that you would want to be worried about on the vendor side. I think to Jerry's point too, obviously with stuff that's happened recently in terms of a single vendor impacting multiple pieces of the infrastructure due to an issue. Not so much having real-time vendor diversity, but the at least documented recovery procedures or fallback procedures if a primary vendor for a particular service is unavailable for some catastrophic reason. What are you doing now? That should be part of business continuity planning, but it also could be parts where that's not really tabletopped or even walked through for years at a time. And you never want to get in that situation and just say, well, what's our backup to this? And there's a note that just says, we'll figure it out at the time.
No, I definitely think too, as we talk about this third-party risk management challenge that everyone's having, is that we have to think back to really obsessing over trust and making trust an imperative. And that goes beyond, a rating that is not only, clear, contextual, and giving you the source data, but also just recognizing the very real position that a company, even a software provider, who you're getting your ratings from, take up among regulators, insurance providers, right? Who is this rating intended for? Is it intended for us to make actionable decisions about our third parties? Or is this rating intended for some, regulator or insurance provider? And when we're using that in our incident response programs, and we're using this as, a good global citizen in the security community, we want to make sure that we're obsessing over trust and that we understand who that data is intended for.
Yeah. Great question coming in from the chat that might speak to this a little bit too, Maggie, but where does the human element, security culture come into play when attempting to enable this holistic approach to third-party risk management, risk mediation efforts, along with, proper classification of your data and attack surface?
Yeah, that's a great point. So again, kind of referencing back to starting career in oil and gas, I think we watched a very similar evolution around safety culture. And I think as long as, back in those days when safety was owned by safety, we continued to have injuries and unfortunately deaths, right? And there was this big intentional push to say, safety, obviously we've got safety folks that guide us, they help us know best practices and what our organizational procedures need to be. But safety is not their responsibility, it's our responsibility. And that was when we really started seeing injury rates fall. Well, I think a lot of this needs to go in the security front and the third-party risk front needs to go the same path. And I think one of the first steps that we need to take to is, and I think this was from I can't remember what podcast, or it was, something hosted by Gartner, but, the speaker made the point that if you raise a risk for working with a third party because of some things you see, and that risk gets accepted, it may not be that you have a risk problem, it's that you have a management problem. And that's that we really, really, really love, I think part of our roles need to be a little bit on the safety front, is pulling our managers and our executive staff and our business staff along, and so they understand the implications related to their business metrics and how they might be impacted. And so I think that starts with transparency. And that I don't want to make light of this. It's a hard job to take the technical observables that we look at day to day and translating that into business speak is hard. But I think doing that and driving that transparency is the first and most important task in front of us today.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Yeah, I love talking about this social dynamic between security and other business units, especially when it comes to, board meetings, right? If you think about all of the stakeholders, and grateful that CISOs are being invited to the table now, far too often they are not still, but if you think about it, right, the security department and really the chief information security officer is one of the only departments that's not driving revenue. And that's a difficult position to be in at those tables, right? They're taking the revenue and securing the organization. So I think where a lot of these issues need to start and be tackled is from a top-down commitment standpoint, right? And a lot of education is necessary, which is sometimes exhausting and frustrating. And that's the real human element of where security comes into play. is continuously advocating for yourself. But that top-down commitment from leadership around a strong security program really influence adherence to policy, and then ultimately just what the folks on the ground level are doing every day. I think it's a problem that's ever evolving and really one central to third-party risk management. But you know, it's something we can continuously tackle with transparency and ownership.
Yeah, I really like how our own CISO, Jason Steer, talks about being an enabler rather than an inhibitor of business. And then to throw it over to you, John, I think with attack surface intelligence and looking at the external attack surface, we see a lot of user error, whether it's people unknowingly making errors or potentially knowingly making errors. Like I feel like we've seen people spinning up websites with their work email. Like there are just all these interesting things that we find. How do we enforce there?
Well, so there's actually an enforcement mechanism if you bring attack surface into that. Traditionally, that's a security training problem. Like, so basically training people not to use business credentials for setting up test resources or potentially shadow IT or even personal stuff. But with the attack surface, and then also identity can give you that information as well. Being able to see that and actually start resolving those types of issues when they pop up, I think that's pretty much the primary thing that we give you when it comes to ASI. Yeah, I think as far as like a enforcement mechanism comes from that awareness, and then secondarily, it's always good when training cycles have a feedback loop of this actually happened. Obviously sanitized a bit, but being able to reinforce that this isn't just a theoretical kind of scenario you have to sit through and plan for. It's no, these are things that we've seen happen in the past. That kind of here's the current outcomes or results from our organization. You see that a lot with phishing training, right? So when they combine anti-phishing training with an actual real-time test, and there's always that slide of 34% of people inside this organization clicked on the link, and so I think it kind of helps drive home that it's legit. It's something you need to worry about.
I think to that point, John, I'm always amazed by this, but our own security team, they put out these reports every few weeks, and then they're called XYZ reports, and it's literally taking an actual event that occurred within recorded future, maybe it was a near miss, and you think like, oh, this is just another bulletin from security, but I mean we're a Google shop, and so you can all see all the icons, but you click into that report and you just see the boop, 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 like the dozens of internal people that right when the email gets sent that are logging in to read that. I mean, and I do think moving from the academic and like formal training and looking to like, gosh, these are obviously anonymized, but my colleagues in the offices I've been to working with systems that I know this was the event that occurred really grounds what we're doing security wise in real life. And I think that's one of the things that we struggle with, is that if the rest of the company doesn't actually see, it's just always these sort of phantom bad guys complete with, like, I don't know, like, anime style avatars that are sort of attacking us that we never can see. But when it's grounded in a real life event, I think it helps sort of wrap the brains around like what steps were taken, where the misses were, and then what the readout items are afterwards. So yeah.
I agree. One fun way to do that too is having somebody from incident response just join a company meeting and talking about something they're really passionate about, or an incident where they were successful in stopping someone. For example, we as a team had a customer actually come and talk about an incident where they were able to shut down ransomware, and brought us through how they use Recorded Future to detect that, sort of the life cycle of it. And it was such a personal, interesting story, one that had, a climax and then a resolution in a way that kept us all thinking about it, while not to glamorize ransomware, but also giving us insight into everyday scenarios. I think that at a larger scale would be interesting for folks in sales or marketing, other divisions that don't get hands-on with those scenarios.
Ransomware doesn't need any more glamorization, does it?
No.
Going back to the Verizon data breach investigation report, they have a great line in there on how anything that adds to your attack surface on the internet can be targeted and potentially be that first foothold for an external threat actor. and that the objective of security teams should be to keep those footholds to a minimum. So starting with John, where do you think organizations are falling short today, and how can they use a solution like Recorded Future to minimize those footholds?
Yeah, the biggest miss we kind of see with ASI or ASMs in generals in terms of how customers are using them is sometimes it can be used as another vulnerability management platform, right? Hey, this is another place I can get CVEs, another place I can get, port information or target information. Really, attack surface management products are intended to be used to engage in attack surface reduction program and process, where you are using the output from ASI to continually prune and offline harden, reduce visibility on what we present to you in terms of data. So like I mentioned before, in terms of ASR methodologies and what the kind of common workflows tend to be, after you have your first set of results back, you're looking for things that the easiest way to remediate or reduce risk is to take something offline. So those targets that are just not supposed to be there anymore, getting those just off the wire. Likewise, we still see a surprising amount of basic port, firewall kind of issues in terms of database ports opening the internet, SSH, RDP, remote access stuff that doesn't necessarily have a business justification, but at the same time can just be pruned off. Like for us, a solid attack surface there's a very minimal port set presented across the entire attack surface, and all of those ports are ones that you can link to a business purpose of some type, right? And so when you've got a organizational policy that says these are the only services that should be open to the internet, these are what they're linked to in terms of a organizational process or business need, and anything else that's open should not be there. That's what, getting that part of the early ASR workflow, once you get into that rhythm of it may be sloppy the first time out and have to tune up the firewall settings, but after that, anything else that pops up is really pretty trivial to spot. Likewise, we still see not really a ton of hardening. So, in ASR, even if you have here's a service, needs to be open for business purpose, the deployment's patched and up to date, there's generally going to be some additional hardening steps you can be taking in addition to an installation of defensive controls on that particular target. But the level of hardening for a particular asset is something that we can kind of spot in terms of misconfiguration exposures. So it's really it's not just the biggest thing is that engaging with that type of process is as a continual thing. Your attack surface is always dynamically changing, and you have to have this expectation of this is driving activity in order to actually reduce those footholds and reduce the ASR metrics overall. It's not just here's another place I can get port and vulnerability data.
Yeah, I think adding on that too, one thing I find with customers when they've done an attack surface intelligence scan with Recorded Future is that even most simply for larger organizations, that recently found asset section is eye-opening. With large organizations, when you scan from a more broad perspective, when we're so ingrained in our everyday workflows of patching vulnerabilities and looking at specific assets, it's harder to see the bigger picture. And what we're able to do is show you maybe some assets that really shouldn't even be there. Maybe somebody went ahead and downloaded some software that they shouldn't, open source software, which we know every company has those people that do that. And just spin up assets maybe for a marketing site. And while teams will argue from a third-party risk management perspective, I don't really care about that. Everything's connected, and the more you can secure your own assets and what are you using and making sure that they're all within policy and procedure, the better. So Recorded Future does continuously pick up on those recently found assets that might not be necessarily something you've included in your scope.
Yeah, before you hop in there, Jerry, I think one of our clients has kind of coined the term abandonware with us. So all those abandoned assets on your attack surface. So a new vocab word for everyone on the call today. Over to you, Jerry.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think it's kind of trying to think of the proxy here to some of the things John was speaking about on the attack surface side, but for the third party side as well. And I think one of the areas that we really struggle and kind of preventing footholds is really just an error of focusing on the wrong things. So for instance, if we've not mapped out the crown jewels and we don't understand how many hops away from those crown jewels like an actual event is from occurring, we may go spend a whole bunch of relational capital and time working with a vendor to resolve things that really are not likely to affect me. So for instance, if I look at some of the big technology providers, the risk of my working with Google is not so much in Google's corporate assets and infrastructure. It's in the products and the services provided by Google that I use. And I may be more, I think a current process tends to be more geared towards, hey, Google corporate, tell me what you do. And of course we care about that. We want to know those things, but in terms of things that are most proximal to affecting me, like the footholds that really might create a risk for me, they live at the product and service level. And I think tying that back to actually understanding, and I love the old school NIST model of a potential like risk assessment. It starts with the threat source, moving to threat events, and the presence of vulnerabilities with an organizational context, and then that's the risk. I was like, giving a talk at Predict last fall, and in the room I said, "Hey, are leak credentials a risk?" And a bunch of people went, "Yes," and I said, "No, that's not a risk. The risk is that those leaked credentials have access, like still have current access to a system that contains data that could compromise you in some shape, way, form, or fashion. That's the risk. You've got to move it to that kind of contextual approach before you start swinging the axe to try to tackle things or resolve things."
Maggie, going back to your example of the client who came to talk about mitigating that ransomware attack, from an anonymized perspective, are you able to kind of share a brief snippet on how they use Recorded Future?
Yeah, definitely. So they were using more of a brand intelligence to tackle those phishing sites really that were coming at them. So what they were able to do was see a significant amount of new domain registrations tied to A records that were of high severity. When you put them together, there was a common theme in the structure of the threat actor and how they were registering these domains. So from there, Recorded Future, in the way that our intelligence works, really connects the dots between each other, where you could click into that domain and quickly understand that the structure of the threat actor helps identify who actually was behind it. Right? Every threat actor has their own little signatures or crumbs that they leave behind, and they were very blatant around how they were structuring the domains that they were using in this phishing attack. So upon collecting all of that intelligence and understanding who it was, the team was able then to use a number of different detection mechanisms to essentially kick them out of the environment from a high level. So that continuous monitoring of your infrastructure even relates to something on the third party side, right? One of our risk rules at Recorded Future alerts you to any third parties that have newly registered domains with a potential for abuse, right? If your third party has that risk rule that triggers off, it might be something that you can share with them to hopefully even have them dig deeper and understand or prevent an incident of this kind.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. And then getting to our last question, I know we're close to time. So if anyone does have any further questions, please drop them in the chat now. But for this final question, I'm going to ask our panelists to put themselves in the shoes of someone that just purchased Recorded Future. What are the initial steps you're taking to secure your first party and third party attack surface? Maggie, I'll go back to you.
Yeah, I think that monitoring those critical vendors is something of utmost importance, especially when it comes to those that will impact your business continuity. I know that's been something we talked about during this panel and webinar as well, but identifying those third parties that if they were to be impacted by service downtime, ultimately you wouldn't be able to do your job. And when we think about that, as Jerry mentioned earlier, I think the first step is just being able to monitor and set alerts to those companies that are that would be potentially experiencing a cyber attack, or being able to be notified the moment of any potential downtime in general. So having that coverage and just that pure information would be my first step.
Over to you,
That's
Jerry.
good. Yeah. So I think if you've put myself in the position of a customer that's just purchased Recorded Future, if you've gone through the normal proof of value, proof of concept cycle with Recorded Future, I think what I would really push folks to do is hang on to those success criteria from the POV. Those were the things that you decided to finally answer the email from the BDR for the salesperson and actually go through a trial. Hang on to those things and institutionalize those objectives, so that the benefit of the capability that, through the testing, the trial solved an organizational challenge just becomes kind of cemented into the process. And then share what you're seeing in Recorded Future widely. This is, transparency is king here. So if you can institutionalize this kind of stuff into the workflows, as opposed to what most of us tend to do, is we fall back into our like normal ways of working, even when we have something new that is valuable in front of us. I think this goes a long way in driving the outcomes that we want.
Yeah, and just to chime in, so I've kind of mentioned attack surface reduction and what the general workflow there. In terms of very initial steps, you want to think about how to enable that workflow. So step one is we're giving you an asset inventory of what we're seeing from our perspective. Rationalize that against your own internal references, so your own internal asset management, CMDB, zone files, other sources of what should be there. Any unknown sources or unknown assets, those have to be justified. And generally that's a investigation flow that not a lot of customers have a high level of maturity around. So basically the problem of, hey, we found this out on the internet, whose server is this? And luckily ASI gives you a lot of clues. So basically when we would want to enable that workflow for a customer org, we've got things like all the port data, banner data, what it's running, what language, what region, where it's located. And so typically if you're trying to narrow down like, hey, here's a given asset on the internet, it's in one of your ASNs, like it's definitely yours. If that's not an immediate answer from those reference sources, there's enough clues there, like, hey, what type of software is running on it? What type of service is it? What language is being used there? Where is it located? And that workflow, making that workflow as efficient as possible is something that you want to work on when you first start out with ASI, because you'll be using it a lot in the future. Like, one of the goals of the product is to find things you're not aware of, and you don't want every single time that happens for it to be kind of a cumbersome detective job to try to track that down. So doing that asset rationalization is probably step one. Post the asset rationalization, you want to break down your external attack surface into first and third party as a first initial slice. Beyond that, you want to get into like what type of service this is. So in other words, there's a big difference between something like a SaaS provider for CRM versus some EC2 instances in AWS. Both from making sure that any of those third-party vendors that have been identified through ASI are linked into TPI, but you want to have an understanding of what your level of security control is, or what your configuration options and then remediation options are going to be in all of those cases. So for each of those, either individual assets or vendors, they should be able to be classed as, hey, this is something that's completely under your control. You can control the network, you can control everything locally. So if there's a patch that needs to go out, that can be wired up. Reconfigs need to happen, that can be wired up. Then you'll have third parties where maybe it's a third party like a CDN with some security capabilities that as a user, you can actually go in and reconfigure. In other cases, you may not have any control over anything in terms of configuration, much less updates for that particular provider. So when an issue is identified, you have to have some type of solution pre-canned before it happens to make sure that, okay, I know that I'm going to bring this issue up to the vendor. They know what to expect. We have an SLA, or we have a expectation of what we're going to get back and when they're going to resolve it. And those are all things that, we'll find those types of issues during ASI usage over time. But if customers haven't already gone through the motions in preparation for that event to happen, it just adds a lot of lag. And when we're talking about lag, when it comes to exposures and risk there, that's just more opportunity for a threat actor to actually exploit that condition. So.
Yeah, I think I'll add to what Jerry mentioned with remembering, the reasons behind purchasing a software like Recorded Future for third-party risk management. What I've seen a lot of teams do is even implement a monthly third-party risk management newsletter across the org, where they're addressing, usually when you're tasked to purchase a tool like this, a lot of times it comes from a directive, maybe from the board or maybe from regulators. Remembering that and then being able to communicate out to the successes you've made with Recorded Future. Maybe that's just even acquiring the tool. You check the box at first, but then continuing the conversation and being able to show the org what you've done and the progress you've made.
Awesome. Well, I know we are 55 minutes of our panel talking, so I don't see any more questions from the chat. I did want to let you know, Jerry, that there is a comment on your workplace security analogy and that they loved it. So I expect to see more presentations around that in the future. Before we go, I just wanted to highlight a couple of things that are coming up in Recorded Future Land. Our registration for our Global Predict series is now open. So if you've been to Predict in the past, that's now open. If you've never been to Predict, it's the largest gathering of threat intelligence professionals in the world across Washington, D.C., London, Singapore, and Tokyo. So whichever location is closest to you, check out our website and register today. Registration is free. And then if you're interested in this topic and want a peek under the hood of how Recorded Future can help mitigate supply chain risk, join myself and technical marketing manager Kathleen Kuzma for a live demo on mitigating supply chain risk. We'll have a link to that in the email with the recording to this webinar. With that, thank you to our panelists and thank you to everyone for attending. Hope we can stay resilient against all those first-party and third-party attack surface risks. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.